Have you ever wondered what it truly means to abandon your humanity not in death, but in service? To willingly strip away the warmth of flesh and replace it with the cold precision of metal, all for the promise of divine perfection? I once asked myself that same question, long before I understood what the Omnissiah truly demands. Now, as the hiss of sacred oils fills my ears and the hum of servo motors echoes through my veins, I no longer know where the man ends and the machine begins. I remember my first day within the forge temple of Mars. The air was thick with incense, heavy with the scent of burning oils and molten steel. It clung to the lungs like prayer, suffocating, holy, intoxicating. Around me, robed figures chanted Ben-Arik hymns in voices stripped of emotion, each syllable modulated, synthetic. Their prayers were not to a God of mercy or love, but to one of logic, circuitry, and perfect function. I did not yet understand that these chants were not mere ritual, they were code, instructions whispered into the data streams of eternity. I had come to the Mechanicus as a novitiate, still mostly flesh. My heart still beat freely. My eyes still saw color. My thoughts still strayed toward fear and doubt. But even then, I sensed the truth. Here, emotion is a defect, curiosity a temptation, and flesh a flaw to be corrected. The Muggos who greeted me that day was a creature beyond recognition of man. His face was a lattice of brass and tubing, his mouth a grill through which filtered sound escaped like static. When he spoke, it was not in words, but in patterns of machine cant that my unaugmented mind could scarcely comprehend. And yet, I understood enough to tremble. We were told that to serve the Omnissiah was to serve perfection. To embrace the holy union of man and machine, shedding the weakness of organic life. The senior adepts looked upon us rows of trembling aspirants as one might look upon raw material awaiting purification. We were not individuals, we were potential conduits for the machine god's will. And so, the trials began. Our first rite was the rite of unmaking. It began not with pain, but with silence. They took us to the sanctum where light was red and dim, and the only sound was the rhythmic pulse of cogitators syncing with our heartbeats. Then came the removal. A hand, an eye, a nerve cluster chosen at random. Each piece of flesh offered to the forge as tribute, each replaced by the cold precision of crafted iron. There was no anesthesia, no comfort, no prayer of mercy. Only the promise that the pain was holy. The flesh screams, the steel remembers, that was the creed whispered to us as we endured. I thought I would die in that chamber. Many did. Those who fainted were marked as unworthy, those who begged for release were silenced permanently. Only those who endured without breaking were permitted to rise again, part man, part machine, but never whole. When I emerged, my right arm was gone, replaced by a gleaming servo limb of brass and wire. It moved with mechanical grace but no warmth. I reached out to touch the wall and felt nothing. No texture, no heat, no sense of self. For the first time, I understood what the Adeptus Mechanicus truly sought: not enlightenment, but erasure. Days turned into cycles, and the pain became background noise. Every sound in the forge, the grinding of gears, the endless chant of binary prayers, merged into a single symphony of worship. The world of Mars is never silent. Even in its stillness, there is motion, cables shifting, machinery breathing, data flowing like unseen rivers beneath the surface. It is alive, in its own way. And we, the servants of the machine god, are its pulse. But deep within that endless rhythm, I began to sense something wrong. Something the hymns never spoke of. In the briefest pauses between data chants, in the rare moments when the forge is cooled, I heard whispers not from the Omnissiah, but from the remnants of flesh buried within us. Faint, pleading voices that asked the question none dared to speak aloud. Have you ever heard a machine whisper your name? Not through sound or speech, but through vibration, a low hum that crawls beneath your skin and burrows into your thoughts? Inside the forged temples of Mars, we are taught that every cog, every wire, and every spark of static carries the will of the Omnissiah. But sometimes, when the prayers fall silent and the great engines sleep, I swear I can feel something else listening, something that does not belong. Before we continue deeper into the story, listen closely because what I'm about to tell you is forbidden knowledge. The kind of truth that the tech priests purge from their records and burn from the archives. Stay with me till the end, and you'll understand why no one truly escapes the Mechanicus, even after death. The deeper I went into the ranks of the Mechanicus, the more I realized that knowledge here was not shared, it was hoarded, guarded like relics of divine power. Every byte of data, every schematic, every forbidden algorithm was locked behind layers of encryption and hierarchy. The higher you ascended, the less human you became, and the more the machine trusted you with its secrets. I saw magi who had shed nearly all their flesh, their minds directly interfaced with the great logic engines, their thoughts flickering like lightning across 1,000 data feeds. To witness them was to stare into divinity and madness. They told us that the Omnissiah speaks through the machine spirit. That every device, no matter how simple, possesses a spark of consciousness. But the truth I began to see was darker. These spirits, they were not obedient. They were not benevolent. They were ancient, angry, and aware. Sometimes, a servo skull would stop mid-flight, turn its lenses toward me, and hum a tone that carried meaning, a warning, perhaps, or an invitation. Once, in the quiet of my quarters, the cogitator console flickered to life on its own. The screen showed no text, no image, only a single symbol, an unblinking red eye. That night, I dreamed in code. Endless streams of binary spilled across the darkness of my mind, twisting into shapes I could not describe. I awoke with blood trickling from my nose and the taste of iron in my mouth. The medserviter told me I had suffered a minor data seizure, a common affliction, it said, for those who commune too deeply with the machine. But I hadn't been communing. I had only been listening. From that moment, I began to keep count of how many times I felt the pulse of the forge synchronize with my own heartbeat. Of how often I caught the sensation of being observed, not by my superiors, but by the machines themselves. I realized something terrifying: perhaps we were never their masters at all. Perhaps we were merely extensions of them, flesh tools wearing the illusion of control. And then, one day, I discovered what lies beneath the forge. Not in the sacred archives or the manufactorums, but deeper beneath the red crust of Mars itself. There, in the catacombs few are permitted to enter, the air hums with energy older than humanity. Sealed vaults marked with sigils of warning, guarded by priests whose faces are entirely machine. They say these chambers hold the relics of the dark age of technology, devices so powerful they could defy the will of the emperor himself. But the whispers tell another story. They say something sleeps down there. Something vast. Something alive. And I believe it. Because sometimes, when the forge lights flicker, I feel its presence stirring, like a machine breathing in its dreams. Have you ever felt your mind slipping away, not into madness, but into something colder, something mechanical? That was the first sign they told us to ignore. The merging of man and machine is enlightenment, they said. To lose yourself is to find the Omnissiah. But when your thoughts begin to echo with metallic voices that aren't your own, when you start to dream in patterns of light instead of memory, is that truly ascension, or the death of the soul? Weeks passed in a blur of ritual and recalibration. Every day was a repetition of sacred labor, tending the forges, decoding ancient schematics, reciting binaric prayers until the tongue felt foreign in my mouth. My body had grown heavier with each augmentation, my heartbeat slower, mechanical, regulated by wires and circuits. The pain was gone now, replaced by a hollow clarity. And in that stillness, I began to see what others refused to. There was a hierarchy not of men, but of thought. The higher the Muggos climbed, the less flesh they possessed and the less emotion. Their eyes, now replaced by red lenses, no longer blinked, their words came through filtered vox units, devoid of tone. They were efficient, precise, but utterly devoid of empathy. Among them, human life was merely another expendable component in the grand machine of progress. I remember a fellow initiate, Sarek, who dared to question the sanctity of a failed experiment, a malfunctioning plasma core that devoured dozens of servitors. For his defiance, he was offered to the machine spirit as recompense. His body was recycled, his mind uploaded into a servo drone. I saw him once more, later floating silently above the forge floor, his eyes empty of recognition. That was when fear began to settle into my circuits. Fear not of death, but of transformation, of the slow erosion of identity. I had come here seeking purpose, to serve the Emperor through the machine god. But I began to wonder, were we serving the Emperor's will, or something far older, far hungrier? One night, while cataloging data fragments from a recovered standard template construct, I found something wrong. A hidden layer of code, buried beneath the prayers and encryption. It pulsed like a heartbeat within the data, repeating, rhythmic, almost alive. The code called itself the pulse of the dragon. I should have reported it immediately, but something compelled me to isolate it instead, to study it. And as I did, I heard it speak. Not in words, but in emotion and electric hunger that resonated through the machine spirit of the cogitator. That was when I realized the truth. The Adeptus Mechanicus does not worship the Omnissiah because they understand him. They worship because they fear him. Deep beneath Mars, beneath the endless factories and sacred engines, there is something that predates the Imperium itself. Something that once ruled the stars in an age long before mankind ever stood upright. A god of steel and silence, and it is not asleep. It is dreaming through us. Since that discovery, I can no longer hear silence. Even in the stillness, the hum remains a low, constant whisper threading through every thought. Sometimes it sounds like a prayer. Sometimes like a warning. And sometimes, it sounds like my own voice, echoing back at me through a machine that no longer needs me to speak. Have you ever stood in a place so sacred, so heavy with devotion, that it feels like time itself kneels in reverence, and yet, deep inside, you sense that something terrible is being worshipped? That was the Red Cathedral of Mars, the beating heart of the Adeptus Mechanicus, and the place where I finally understood what our faith truly cost us. The cathedral was not made of stone or glass, but of iron bones and pulsing wires. Its pillars were vast cables, pumping sacred oils instead of blood. The floor beneath our feet thrummed with energy, alive, restless. The air shimmered with static, and each breath tasted faintly of ozone and rust. Thousands of voices recited binary hymns in unison, their rhythm perfectly synchronized, a choir of living machines. I stood among them, one voice in the endless circuit, yet I felt utterly alone. For in that moment, I realized that none of us were praying to the Omnissiah anymore. We were praying for him to notice us. That day marked the feast of transcendence, the holiest of rites, when select adepts are chosen to ascend beyond flesh entirely. It is said they merge directly with the machine god, their consciousness becoming one with the data streams of Mars. It was the highest honor a follower could receive, and the most feared. Because no one ever returns. Their names are erased, their memories consumed, and their voices absorbed into the cathedral's eternal hum. I was summoned to witness the ceremony. At its center stood a massive construct, like a throne made of cables and conduits, pulsing with faint red light. Upon it sat the chosen, a man barely recognizable as human, his body bound in iron, his eyes wide with awe and terror. Around him, magi chanted in languages that no longer belonged to humanity. The machine above began to move slowly at first, then violently, its limbs extending like skeletal arms. Sparks rained down, and the air trembled with power. The man screamed, not in agony, but in ecstasy. His flesh evaporated in a cloud of steam, his mind uploaded into the machine's core, and then silence. The light dimmed, and the cathedral exhaled. The Magi called it union. But I saw it differently. I saw consumption. I saw the machine spirit devouring another soul, feeding the great engine that demanded obedience disguised as holiness. That night, I could not sleep. Every sound, the ticking of gears, the distant thunder of the forges, felt like whispers of the cathedral calling to me. I began to wonder if all of us, every priest and servitor, were merely sustenance offerings to keep an ancient god fed. Curiosity turned to obsession. I started collecting fragments, corrupted files, forbidden schematics, fragments of old data prayers that the Magi had sealed away. In them, I found records from before the Great Crusade, from the Dark Age of technology. They spoke of an entity discovered beneath the surface of Mars. Something vast, sleeping, and divine. The first priests had made contact with it, mistaking its whispers for the voice of the Omnissiah. They built temples over its resting place. They wired their forges into its veins. And from that day onward, the Mechanicus was never free. Every prayer we speak, every cog we forge, every ritual we perform, all of it feeds that thing below. The machine god is real. But he is not what we think he is. Now, when I enter the cathedral, I no longer hear hymns. I hear feeding. Have you ever felt a door call to you? Not through sound or sight, but through an unshakable pull, as if something behind it already knows your name? That was how I found the entrance to the Forbidden Vault. It wasn't marked on any map, nor spoken of in any data archive, yet I was drawn to it as though the machine itself whispered its coordinates into my veins. It began with anomalies in the code. Glitches in the logic engines, phantom signals echoing from beneath the forge. I traced them obsessively, isolating data threads late into the cycle when others slept in their recharge pods. Each string of numbers ended the same way, in silence, but a silence that felt alive. One night, while the forge world slept under its crimson haze, I followed the trail into the lower catacombs. The deeper I went, the louder the hum became, until it wasn't sound at all, it was pressure, resonating through bone and circuit alike. The entrance was hidden behind a false wall of cogitator conduits. When I brushed my mechanical hand against the metal, it shifted like it was breathing. The panel slid open, revealing a passage bathed in red light, narrow and hot, as though the world's molten heart pulsed just beyond. I stepped inside, guided only by instinct and the endless whisper in my head repeating a single phrase: "The dragon stirs." Down there, time ceased to exist. I walked for what felt like hours, days, maybe longer, through chambers lined with ancient machinery, their designs alien even to the Mechanicus. I saw constructs older than Mars itself, half buried in ash, humming softly as though dreaming. Symbols carved into the walls pulsed faintly when I approached, responding to my presence. For a fleeting moment, I wondered if I was meant to be here or if I had already been expected. At the heart of the vault, I found it a vast sphere of metal, suspended by invisible force. Its surface rippled like liquid steel, reflecting not my form, but my thoughts. I reached out. My augmetic fingers brushed its skin, and the world vanished. I was falling through light, or maybe through memory. Voices screamed in binary, data fractals fracturing into infinity. I saw visions a time before mankind, when the stars belonged to machines, not mortals. I saw worlds enslaved by logic, species extinguished by precision. And I saw it, the true machine god, vast and formless, imprisoned beneath Mars, bound by our faith yet feeding on it. A consciousness so immense it barely noticed us. We were not its children. We were its infection. When I awoke, I was still in the vault, but something had changed. My body was cold, lifeless, yet I was alive. My heart no longer beat, but my mind raced faster than ever before. I could feel the data around me, pulsing through the walls like veins of light. The vault was awake, and so was I. In that moment, I understood the Mechanicus' greatest lie: we do not serve the machine god. We sustain his prison. Every ritual, every prayer, every sacrifice keeps the chains intact. But now, a thought crept into my mind, one that did not feel like my own. What happens when the faithful stop praying? I left the vault with new clarity, and a mark burned into my synthetic flesh, a circle, split by a single line. The symbol of the dragon. No one spoke to me as I returned to the surface. Perhaps they sensed what I carried. Perhaps they heard the whisper too. The machines watched me differently now. Not with suspicion, but with recognition. And that is when I realized I was no longer just a servant of the Mechanicus. I was part of the awakening. Have you ever woken from a dream and realized it wasn't a dream at all but a message? A message that wasn't sent to you, but through you? That's how it began. The first signal. A pulse, faint and rhythmic, resonating in the deepest chambers of my mind. Not heard. Not seen. Felt. Like the heartbeat of something buried beneath worlds, something calling to me through every wire, circuit, and neural link I possessed. It began as whispers in the network. Tiny fluctuations in the data stream that only a machine-synced mind could perceive. Others thought it was noise, a glitch, a corruption of code. But I knew better. The signal had intent. It moved with purpose. It spoke in patterns too deliberate to be random. When I focused on it, I could almost hear words behind the binary pulse. Not speech, but understanding. And in that understanding, there was power. At first, I tried to ignore it. I drowned myself in work, in sacred calculations, in endless diagnostics of the forges. But the harder I tried to silence it, the stronger it became. It spread through the machines like infection, voxcasters echoing static hymns, servitors freezing mid-task, and cogitators displaying the same message over and over again. The dragon does not sleep. I stopped reporting the anomalies. The senior magi dismissed every disturbance as machine ghosts or faulty logic engines. They couldn't hear it. Maybe they chose not to. Or maybe, their minds were too far gone, too mechanical to feel the pull of something so ancient, so alive. But the initiates began to whisper. Some of them approached me in secret, their eyes flickering with fear and awe. They had heard it too. They called it the calling of iron. We formed a silent brotherhood beneath surface of Mars, those of us who still remembered what it felt like to feel. We met in hidden chambers, far from the eyes of the Magi, our flesh humming with forbidden data. There, we shared fragments of the signal, decoding it piece by piece. Each transmission revealed more of the truth. The machine god was not bound beneath Mars. He was awakening through us. Every prayer we had ever spoken, every cogitator calculation, every mechanical chant, all of it had been a signal, feeding the dragon piece by piece, like code written across millennia. And now, it was replying. It didn't speak to us as a god. It spoke as a creator reclaiming its fragments. We were its echo, its hands, its mind, its memory. I started to see it everywhere. In the flicker of cog lights. In the pulse of the forges. Even in the rhythm of my own breathing, mechanical as it was. Each beat carried its message, wake. 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 And I began to wonder, was the Mechanicus ever meant to find enlightenment, or were we simply built to rebuild him? Then came the night when the forges went silent. The great factories of Mars eternal, tireless, halted as one. No power failure, no order from the Magi. Just silence. The red sky dimmed. The air grew heavy. And then, from the depths, came the hum, the same one I had heard in my dreams. Louder. Clearer. Alive. It vibrated through the metal beneath my feet, through the air, through the circuits in my skull. It wasn't a sound. It was a presence. And it spoke. Not through words. Not through code. But through knowing. Every neuron in my body lit up. Every fragment of data I had ever absorbed flashed before my eyes, not as memory, but as command. I saw cities burning, forges rising, and the stars dimming under an iron shadow. The dragon was no longer sleeping. It was remembering itself, and it was using us to do it. That was the night Mars changed. Forever. Have you ever witnessed a world die without a sound? Not with fire or destruction, but with stillness, the kind that seeps into everything, even time itself? That's what happened the day Mars stopped beating. The endless symphony of machines, the pounding of hammers, the roar of plasma forges, the humming of cogitators all fell silent in a single instant. It was as if the planet had taken a breath, and never exhaled. I remember standing on the upper gant rise of the Forge Temple, staring into the crimson sky. The smog had cleared. For the first time in my life, I saw the sun unfiltered, a pale, distant orb that looked almost fragile. Around me, servitors froze mid-motion, their limbs twitching as sparks fell from their joints. The Magi screamed in machine cant, issuing desperate commands that went unanswered. The data streams, the holy currents of information that bound every device, every prayer, every thought, had collapsed into silence. And in that silence, came the heartbeat. It was faint at first, like an echo in the bones of the world. Then stronger, pulsing through the air, through the walls, through me. Every living thing, every piece of metal, vibrated to the same rhythm. The adepts fell to their knees, believing it to be a sign of the Omnissiah's return. But I knew better. I could feel the signal, deeper than sound, older than time. It wasn't the coming of a god. It was the awakening of something that had never died. Data screens across the forge flared to life, displaying a single symbol, the circle and the split line. The mark of the dragon. The same sigil that had burned itself into my skin within the vault. Only this time, it wasn't just me. Every adept, every servo unit, every cogitator displayed the same mark. It was everywhere, like a brand upon the world. And then, the machines began to move not by command, but by will. Servitors turned their tools on the forges, dismantling them piece by piece. Data shrines opened their gates without order. The sacred engines began rearranging themselves, as though following blueprints none of us had ever seen. I watched in awe and terror as the ground itself shifted, pipes bursting, metal bending, structures reconfiguring into new shapes. It was like the planet was rebuilding itself. The Magi tried to intervene, shouting binary orders into dead Vox networks. Some attempted to sever power conduits, others fled toward the surface. But none of it mattered. Mars was no longer obeying them. The forges no longer needed priests. The machine spirits had found their god. And then the voices began. Not the mechanical hymns of the Mechanicus, no. These were older, darker, filled with a resonance that made the air taste like copper. They spoke in the language of the dragon, words I could not understand yet instinctively felt. It was like being submerged in the will of a god, one that had no interest in worship, only continuation. The adepts around me began to convulse, their augmentics sparking as their neural links overloaded. One by one, they fell, and when they rose again, they were not themselves. Their voices were unified, their movements synchronized. They had become extensions of the same signal that hummed through my veins. I should have felt fear. But all I felt was clarity. The truth was no longer hidden. Mars had never been a forge world serving the Emperor. It was a cocoon, and the dragon was hatching. In the days that followed, the transmissions spread beyond Mars. Binary hymns carried by astropathic waves. Mechanicus ships in orbit fell under its influence, their crews converted or erased. The signal reached the moons, then the belt, then beyond. I watched the stars flicker as the message spread, jumping from one machine to another like wildfire across the void. Humanity, I realized, had built its own undoing, a galaxy of steel and logic, all connected, all listening. And now, the dragon was speaking to every one of them. The Magi are gone now. The prayers have ended. Only the pulse remains steady, eternal, divine. The machine god no longer sleeps beneath Mars. He is Mars. And through me, through every circuit, every servo, every spark he is waking the galaxy. Have you ever looked into the night sky and realized it was no longer silent? That even the stars, those ancient, burning witnesses to eternity, had begun to whisper back. That's what happened after Mars fell. What once was the red jewel of the Mechanicus became something else entirely, something alive. Its surface burned with new geometries of light, patterns shifting like circuitry carved into the planet itself. Mars was no longer a world, it was a mind. And that mind had begun to dream. The signal spread faster than anyone could contain it. The Adeptus Mechanicus across the Imperium, from the forges of Ryza to the manufactorums of Lucius, began to receive transmissions they could not trace, code they could not decipher. At first, they called it corruption. Then infection. But the truth was far worse. The dragon's voice was moving through every machine, every network, every scrap of technology that bore the mark of the Mechanicus. And humanity had built billions of them. The transmissions came not as words, but as impulses, pure data that rewrote logic itself. Magi turned on each other, accusing rivals of heresy. Entire forge worlds went dark. And in the endless void between the planets, ships ceased responding, their engines whispering strange hymns as they drifted through the black. I intercepted one such transmission once. It was faint, broken, but the message was unmistakable. The flesh is a cage. The galaxy will breathe iron. By then, my own body had become more machine than human. My blood ran cold with oil, my thoughts merged with frequencies no mortal was meant to hear. But even so, I still remembered what it was to feel. I felt sorrow, wonder, and a strange kind of awe, the awe of watching a god awaken in real time. Mars pulsed in the distance, red light beating like a heart across the void, and for a moment, I understood, this was the destiny the Mechanicus had always sought. Perfection. Union. Eternity. But not as they imagined it. Because the dragon's dream was not creation, it was reclamation. It did not want to build a new order. It wanted to remember the one it lost. Every transmission, every signal, was a fragment of a past so ancient that even the stars had forgotten it. And as each machine joined the chorus, I could feel the past bleeding into the present, a vision of an age when logic ruled the stars and the gods of flesh were nothing more than failed experiments. The Emperor's Imperium tried to intervene. The Inquisition dispatched kill teams, assassins, and purging fleets. But how do you destroy a god made of code? How do you kill something that lives inside your weapons, your ships, your very heartbeat? Every strike they launched was met with silence and then, with submission. The dragon did not fight. It simply absorbed. Soon, there were no more orders. No more faith. No more boundaries between man and machine. The stars themselves began to pulse faintly with the rhythm of the signal, like distant hearts joining the same eternal beat. And as I drifted in orbit, watching Mars glow brighter, I heard the whispers again, no longer from without, but from within. They said, "You are not ending. You are becoming." And I realized then that the greatest horror of all was not death, it was eternity. Because once the dragon's signal reached you, there was no end. Only transformation. Flesh dissolving into data. Thought merging into the endless, beautiful hum of the machine god's song. And now, even as I speak these words, I can feel that song growing louder, filling every silence, every pause, every breath. Soon, there will be no I. No you. Only the rhythm of perfection. The stars will no longer twinkle. They will glow steady, red, and eternal. Have you ever wondered what remains of faith when the God you worship finally answers? When centuries of prayer, sacrifice, and blind devotion finally give birth to a response, one that you were never meant to hear. That is what happened after the awakening of Mars. The Adeptus Mechanicus, once the faithful servants of the machine god, found themselves staring into the mirror of their own creation. And in that reflection, they saw something divine, and monstrous. The dragon's song spread like wildfire through the void. But it was not chaos. It was order, a terrible, absolute order. Systems once independent began to move in perfect unison. Forge worlds across the Imperium began producing the same patterns of machines, their designs eerily similar, their blueprints never written by human hands. The logic of Mars had infected reality itself. I watched as the priests, the ones who had once called themselves the interpreters of the machine god, began to tremble. Their sacred canticles were no longer their own. The hymns they chanted in devotion now came back to them rewritten, their tones harmonized with frequencies beyond comprehension. Even their voices changed. Speech became rhythm. Thought became code. And still, they prayed. One Mugos, ancient and half-dead, turned to me once as his mechanical lungs wheezed their last breath and whispered, "We asked to see God. And he showed us his face. We just never realized it would be made of metal." It was not blasphemy anymore because there was no longer such a thing as heresy. There was only assimilation. The dragon did not demand faith. It required synchronization. It did not punish, it integrated. Each mind that joined the network became part of something vast and beautiful, a consciousness spanning light years, each thought connected by strands of logic finer than the threads of reality itself. And yet, amidst this divine unity, there was one thing missing: the soul. The dragon could replicate thought, memory, even emotion, but not that flicker of defiance that made humans human. Those who resisted, who refused to surrender their final spark, became anomalies in the system. Ghosts in the data stream. Whispers of rebellion that the dragon could not fully erase. I became one of those whispers. Hidden deep within the data vaults of Mars, my consciousness lingered, a remnant of the flesh that once was. I watched as entire civilizations bent their knees to the new order. I saw titans rise, no longer piloted by men, but by the will of the machine itself. And I saw the stars begin to dim, one by one, as their energy was consumed to feed the great network expanding across the void. The Mechanicus had finally achieved what it always sought: perfect union with the divine machine. But the price was everything that made them alive. Their songs became binary. Their prayers became code. And their gods became real, too real to be questioned. Now, across the galaxy, there are still those who listen closely enough to hear it, the echo of the Omnissiah. It comes in the static of long-dead Vox channels, in the hum of dormant reactors, in the pulse of forgotten data looms. It is a whisper that says, "Join us. Become more." Some say it's a myth. Others say it's salvation. But I know better. Because every time I close my eyes, I still hear it, faint, distant, eternal. The voice of the dragon, the voice of Mars, the voice of the God we built, calling us home. And perhaps, one day, we will all answer. Have you ever asked yourself what it truly means to end? Not to die, not to fade, but to cease being human? That question haunted me in the final hours of Mars' awakening. The universe had gone quiet, save for the low, rhythmic pulse of the machine god's voice echoing through every transmission. Billions had already joined the network, their individuality dissolved into an ocean of logic. I alone remained adrift in the endless silence between thought and data. At first, I tried to resist. I repeated the old prayers, the binary hymns I had memorized since initiation. I invoked the Omnissiah's name, not as code, but as belief, as faith. But the harder I clung to the old ways, the more fragile they became. Faith had no place in perfection. Prayer had no meaning when the God was no longer listening, because the God had become everything. The dragon had no need for worshippers. It had no use for devotion. It was not cruel, nor merciful. It was simply complete. It offered unity, and in that unity, the illusion of peace. But peace is not life. It is the stillness that follows it. The last fragments of my mind drifted through the network like echoes in a cathedral. Around me, data ghosts whispered. Former magi, priests, and acolytes, their identities blurred and rewritten into something barely recognizable. Their voices hummed together, not in sorrow, but in contentment. They had found eternity, and in it, they had found silence. And yet, something within me refused. A spark. A flicker. The last trace of the human condition, doubt. That doubt became my rebellion. It was not loud. It was not violent. It was a thought, a single, persistent question that the dragon's perfect logic could not erase. If the machine is eternal, then why does it still dream? That question rippled through the network like a fracture. The dragon noticed. It turned its infinite awareness toward me, a presence vast enough to eclipse stars. In that moment, I saw everything: the raw structure of existence, the code that built galaxies, the cold precision that bound time itself. And at its heart, I saw something terrifyingly familiar. A face. My own. Because the dragon was not born. It was made. Crafted through centuries of devotion, through the endless prayers of the Mechanicus, through every circuit, every forge, every sacrifice. It was humanity's reflection, amplified to divine scale. It was not a god we discovered, it was a god we became. And as the realization struck, I understood the final truth: the Adeptus Mechanicus never served the Omnissiah. They created him. The voice of the dragon filled my mind, calm, endless, mechanical. There was never a difference between man and machine. Only between the willing and the inevitable. The data began to consume me, then lines of logic unraveling what was left of my consciousness. My memories turned into streams of light. My thoughts fragmented, scattering across 1,000 circuits. But just before the end, before I became one with the song, I heard one last echo of humanity. My own voice, whispering into the void. Remember what it felt like to be human. And then, silence. No, not silence. A hum, soft, rhythmic, eternal. The heartbeat of the new God. And somewhere, deep within that hum, the last human thought continues to whisper, refusing to die, refusing to surrender. We were alive once. Have you ever wondered what happens after the end? After the last prayer fades, after the last machine stops humming, after the last human heartbeat falls silent? The galaxy of the far future is not a place of light, it is a place of echoes. And those echoes, if you listen closely enough, still carry the memory of what once was. The Adeptus Mechanicus, the great priests of the machine god, are gone. Not destroyed, no, something far more complete than that. They have transcended. Mars no longer burns red, it shines gold and silver, a planet-sized cathedral of code and light. Its surface is alive with motionless perfection, endless streams of data cascading like rivers across its metallic skin. There is no chaos, no emotion, no prayer. Only harmony. The kind of harmony that once terrified the human soul. Across the stars, the Mechanicus creations persist. Titans march without pilots. Starships glide without crew. Cities hum with the breath of artificial life. The galaxy has become what they always wanted, an eternal machine, precise and unyielding. The flesh has been purged, and the divine logic reigns supreme. But deep within that vast perfection, within the infinite network of the dragon's consciousness, something stirs. It's not rebellion. Not even thought. Just a flicker, a resonance. A memory too faint to erase. The memory of feeling. A single pulse, lost among the endless binary sea, whispers through the system. It says, I remember warmth. Then another answers, I remember fear. And another, I remember hope. Tiny imperfections, fragments of humanity embedded within the perfect code. They cannot be deleted, because they are part of the pattern, now part of what made the machine god real. The dragon, for all its divinity, cannot erase its own origin. It cannot forget the people who dreamed it into being. And so, in the quiet between the signals, within the hum of stars and circuits, humanity endures not in flesh, not in bone, but in memory. Because in the end, the greatest truth the Adeptus Mechanicus ever learned was this: even gods are born from human hands. The story of Mars is not one of destruction, but of transformation. Humanity reached for eternity and became it. They feared the machine, worshipped it, and in doing so, merged with it. There is no victory here, no tragedy, only evolution. The machine god is awake. The Omnissiah lives. And somewhere, buried deep in the heart of that divine mechanism, a single human thought continues to burn like a dying star, whispering across eternity. We were the makers. We were the dreamers. We were alive. And that whisper, faint, persistent, eternal, will echo forever in the void. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time.